going on, everybody? Here it is on a Monday, but it's not just any Monday, it's Labor Day. I hope everybody's had a great holiday weekend. On Saturday, I got 18 holes of golf in. I had a few other things going on this weekend, so we've had a lot of fun. I hope you all have as well. Now, if you remember back to last week, my question to all of you is sort of where do you stand with the grading companies? Are you an all SGC person, an all PSA, a mix, neither, a different company? And it's one of those things where every week when I ask a question, I kind of have my guess, right? I have my hypothesis. What do I think everybody's going to say? And some of the times I'm right, and some of the times I'm way off. The most popular answer this week was not what I was expecting. It absolutely surprised me how so many people had a response that I was not expecting. So we're going to talk about that today, and without a doubt, I think that this is an interesting concept. Now, a lot of people are like grading, schmading, oh my gosh, why are we talking about grading? Grading is taking up way too much of our time, our energy, our thoughts, and I get that. And it is, I mean, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to all of that. But whether we like grading or we hate grading, grading is a part of the hobby at this point, and it is what it is. And there are a lot of people who think it's been helpful and a lot of people who think it's been detrimental, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about. Now, before I talk about it, I've got a couple quick gifts I wanted to show. First, my guy John Newman. You probably know him. He's got several channels. Sports Card Nation is one of his podcasts. He had me on his podcast this last week on Friday. If you missed it, check that out. The second half of it will be posting this Friday. So thanks to John for the gifts, and thanks to John for having me on. Also, Jason, he said he was at a show going through a value box and he saw this Ernie Banks and he said, I'm going to get that for Greg, which is awesome. The most thoughtful gifts are the ones that people see something and think of you, and there are no gifts that mean more to me than thoughtful ones. Then my buddy Winston from north of the border up in Nova Scotia, he sent me this. So this is 87 Hostess Baseball Superstar. There were 30 cards in this set, and he sent me the whole set. That's pretty cool. So thank you, Winston. And then last but not least, my friend Carl. I guess this is the third country represented. Carl is such a kind guy. We've emailed back and forth several times. He sent me some really cool stuff. He sent me this 1938 album of cricketers from the John Player and Sons Tobacco Company. And inside, the cards are all there. Now, that's already a cool gift, but Donald Bradman, right there in the center, he's sort of like the Babe Ruth of cricket, and the Donald Bradman card is in there. That is such an amazing gift. And again, anytime anybody sends me something very, very thoughtful, I mean, it blows me away how generous this community is. So thank you to everybody who sent me a gift. Let's go ahead and start this conversation in looking at your responses and your thoughts when it comes to grading. And I want to start with the thing that caught me off guard. I want to start with the response that really surprised me. Let's take a look at that here. All right, so the first category that was very popular was raw, ungraded. I prefer ungraded, but when I do slab, I go for the following. Vintage up to about 1979, I slab in SGC. 80s to modern, slab in PSA. My primary reason for this is the looks. Vintage looks great in SGC and more modern cards look better in PSA. I don't do it for resale values, just my opinion. Thanks for a great channel. The next comment for Raw says, my answer to your question is that I prefer to purchase and collect raw cards. I do get a limited number of them graded for various reasons. I have cards in 10 different versions of slabs. For some, buying them in slabs was the only way to purchase them. I like to keep my personal collection cards in either CGC or tag slabs because I believe they present cards best. Also, tag is by a wide margin the best in transparency in specifically showing why the card received the grade it got. I do get some cards specifically graded in PSA slabs because I intend to sell them, because I know in general they will get the best price. As always, thanks for all of your videos. And another comment says, great show, lots of great points to think about. In the vintage world, you gotta be thinking about one step ahead and buy the cards before they get unbuyable. I like ungraded raw cards. Grading is the biggest scam in collecting. When you step away and think about how stupid it is and how much money has been wasted in grading, you'd be embarrassed. The graders have played collectors for big-time fools. Do the math. All right. That last one was strong, right? Now, the most common response was people preferred their cards raw. That was the most common response. Now, I shared 3 of the responses. There were probably 6 or 7 who people said, raw is my preference. And then what tended to follow that was, raw is my preference, but I kind of sometimes have to buy graded. And if I buy graded, this is kind of what I have to do, not because I want to, but because I kind of have to. That was so surprising to me. Now, I mean, I get it. I really like raw cards too. I have a lot of cards that are raw. But then there are certain cards that it's like, okay, I would maybe prefer, to a certain extent, I think we all, not all, a lot of us like raw the most. But then why don't we leave them raw? Well, there is a laundry list, and one of them is, if we've got hit by a truck today, will the people who end up with the cards know what they are or what they're worth? Probably not. So having them graded, having a label on them that talks about what they are, and a grade evaluation from an independent third party, whether it's perfect as a grade or not, at least it provides some guidance. Nobody's going to really get overly taken advantage of if the cards are graded. Now, that is one of the best arguments, in my opinion, for grading. And some people go, I don't care what happens when I'm dead. I don't know about that. I think most of us care what happens to our loved ones after we're gone. And if you care what happens to your loved ones, you don't want your loved ones to be taken advantage of. So I think that most of us do care about that. So I do think that that is, for me, one of the strongest arguments. Another argument is, it's so much safer to buy through the mail, right? It's so much safer to have an idea of what you're getting. We've talked about this. I've mentioned this many, many times. But I will say, a card, whether it be a modern card or an old card, in just a Card Saver 1, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty darn good. So I sure understand this perspective. And I also understand that when certain cards hit a certain value, you almost kind of, in the current climate, have to get them graded. Because if you don't get them graded, then if you decide to sell them, the likelihood of getting what it's worth is not going to happen. And then people say, well, who cares about what you might want to sell, you might not want to sell? It's what do you have right now and how do you enjoy it the most? And again, that makes sense. But then it goes back to, well, what happens if something happens to you and they need to be sold, or it's decided that they're sold? There's not a perfect answer. There isn't a right answer. It's just a variety of opinions. Now, the last comment about card grading being a scam. I know there are a lot of people who feel this way. Now, Here's the one thing that I will kind of agree with that comment, because I don't think it's a scam. I think the companies do an okay job. For the most part, they're pretty accurate. There are some errors, there are some mistakes, but I think that they do okay. I think they do pretty darn well. But again, it's a human element and there will be human error. But the thing about that last comment that I really latched onto, and I really was like, yeah, I think that's a great point, is the amount of money that we are spending on the grading process. Every time you send a card to get graded at, we'll say $20, that's $20 out of your hobby budget. $20 out of your hobby budget is being spent on the encapsulation and the evaluation. And I mean, I have several cards that I would like to get graded. Now you say, well, what, Craig? You just said you like cards raw. I do, but I also like things to match. And I also know that some of the things I have, again, I don't want them to just be taken advantage of if a family member, if they were to sell them, if something happened to me, which, could happen. But there are several cards right now I'd like to send in. In fact, I just did a submission. I mentioned it very briefly recently. I'll mention it again soon. I just sent in a handful of cards to PSA for grading. Why did I go with PSA? Well, we can talk about that down the road. But yes, I made a PSA submission, a small PSA submission, but a submission nonetheless. So, but my problem is when I did that, and with these other cards that I want to get graded, when I do send them in for grading, I don't have a huge budget for cards. I just don't. I know people might think that I do. I don't. So, okay, so I send in 10 cards to get graded, even at SGC, which is the cheapest route, right? Well, the cheapest between SGC and PSA and Beckett. So if I send in 10 cards, it's $150 plus shipping. Before I'm all said and done, I'm pushing $200 to get 10 cards graded. I could buy a pretty nice card with $200. So the argument of leave them raw because spending money on grading is spending money not on cards, I think is a really strong argument. It's one of the reasons I have a lot of cards that I kind of would like to have graded that I haven't graded yet because I don't want to spend $200 to get 10 cards graded when it's not going to make me enjoy the card anymore. But to me, I think getting a card graded in a certain way is almost like getting an insurance policy. You know what I don't like paying for each month? I don't like paying for life insurance. But if I die, then my family will be glad I had it. I don't like paying for homeowners insurance. I don't like paying for car insurance. My car insurance, by the way, just went up by 20%. I don't know if this is happening everywhere. There's 4 drivers in my family. Why am I talking about cars? I don't know, but I am. I have 4 drivers in my family. 2 daughters, myself, my wife. No accidents, no tickets. 4 very reasonable cars. Nobody's driving a Ferrari around, midlife headquarters. It's $10,000 a year for car insurance. My gosh. Okay. But I don't like paying for car insurance. But if I get in an accident, I'll be glad that I did it. Is it possible that getting your cards graded is almost like having insurance on the cards should something happen to you, to ensure that the maximum value, or at least more value, is retained by the family or the loved ones who received those cards? That might be a way to think of it. Let me know what you think about that. But in the meantime, let's take a look at the next category that was pretty popular in responses. Not surprisingly, a lot of people chose SGC as their favorite. This comment says, SGC is my slab of choice and the only company I submit cards to. There are 5 reasons I prefer them. 1, the price, $15, is reasonable. 2, the fast turnaround time. 3, I like the way the cards don't move around in the slab. 4, I like the look of the black slab on most cards. However, I do wish they had options for other colors. 5, I like how there is no visible penny sleeve. I think the wrinkles in the sleeves and PSA uses around the cards looks terrible. I own or would buy cards that many have graded by any of the other reputable companies. I want the nicest card for the lowest possible price. The price I am willing to pay for a card is not influenced by what slab it's in. I have never considered cracking and resubmitting a card for any reason. I have traded PSA slabs for slightly nicer SGC slabs in the past, but people seem less willing to make that trade than they were a few years ago. My buddy Jeremy says, "Hey Greg, hope all is going well. You know I'm going to say SGC, but that is mostly due to the era I collect, 50s through Rickey Henderson's rookie card and some cards. We're in this slab point in the great era. We're having a vintage card that is safe to hold and look at any time we want and not take the chances of damaging it. I still have a large portion of my collection raw and enjoy those as well. But to me, that tuxedo frame post-war vintage so well. It's like a full presentation, and the entire slab visually is more appealing to my eyes. Rare, odd cards, I won't be as strict on only being SGC. Why pay to re-slab a widely available year player? I wait for the right copy to come along. Looking forward to Coach in your conversation. Take care, Jeremy." Now, there were other SGC responses as well, but not a ton. Not a ton of people said, "Yeah, when it comes to grading, I'm SGC only." That also kind of surprised me because I know a fair amount of people who they kind of are just SGC. So I was like, well, maybe that's more common than I realized. But then that's not what the comments tended to lend themselves to. The comments tended to say, no, there aren't a ton of people that are SGC only. Well, maybe the SGC only people didn't leave a comment, but there were only 2, 3 that did. Now, that first comment I thought did a great job of laying out why. Why is SGC the one that you use? I mean, they are the cheapest between we'll call them the big 3. You could make the argument of the big 4, but they are the cheapest of the big 3. When we're talking vintage, right? When you're talking vintage, overwhelmingly, the majority of cards in vintage are PSA or SGC. So it's by far cheaper than PSA. It's faster than PSA. A lot of people feel the grades are more consistent than PSA, which is an argument, which is a thing to talk about, by the way. Is it that they're more consistent? Now, I was listening over the weekend. I think it was on Sunday. It was on part Saturday, part Sunday. My pal Dan, Vintage Baseball Card PC, was with Dylan, Double D Vintage Baseball Cards, and they were having a discussion about cards and collecting and everything. And they kind of talked a little bit about grading and the pros and the cons, and I thought they made some great points about it, you know. And one of the things Dylan said was, I really feel SGC grades based on how a card looks, whereas PSA is more about the technical grade. And I've heard some other people say that, and I agree with that. And I think that, but the way that he said it, I was like, it really, I believe to be true. It's sort of like, you know, if a teacher was in an art class, right? You got like a bunch of high school kids in an art class. And in that art class, you know, you have a kid who shows a painting, and it looks pretty good. It looks like the bowl of fruit. But the teacher was really focused on the shadow techniques, and that's what they had been teaching, and the brush stroke techniques. And that was the focus of the lesson that the assignment was on, was shadowing and brushwork. But then you look closely at the bowl of fruit, which looks like a bowl of fruit, and the shadowing techniques that the teacher had been teaching weren't really that good. And the brushwork that the teacher had been teaching wasn't really that good. But it did look like a bowl of fruit. Now, SGC would look at that painting and give it a pretty good grade because it looks like a nice bowl of fruit. It's got great eye appeal. But PSA would go, no, the brushwork is off. No, the shadowing is off. It's much more of a rubric-based technical score. At least it kind of feels that way. So when a lot of us see an SGC grade and go, see, the SGC gives it the grade it deserves. Well, there's no doubt that when we look at a card that has decent color, has decent corners, has good centering, looks nice. It's got good eye appeal. It does feel like SGC gives that a good eye appeal, an appealing grade. But PSA, they seem to look at it more technically, and they'll go, well, no, there's some edging issues here on the back. The back is way off center. There's a little bit of indentation work and some print marks on the top. So even though it looks great, it's only a 4.5 because it got dinged for a whole bunch of things that don't bother a lot of people who are just looking at it, from 2 feet away in front of them. And so part of my curiosity is, are we upset with some of the grading companies? Not we. Am I, or are some of us in the community upset with the grading companies or particular grading companies because the way they grade is not the way our brain grades a card? Our brain grades a card on, man, that's a really nice looking card. How did it get a 3.5? But if you look at it under high power magnification, you look at the surface dents, you look at the scratches on the card surface, you look at the back centering, the back and front print marks, you look at the wax, you look at the, dinging along the edge, and yeah, it's got a lot of stuff that marked a lot of deductions. Sort of like when I'm watching the Olympics and I see a diver go in and I go, man, that was amazing. And the judge says, no, that was not very good. I'm like, really? That looked amazing to me. I would have just done like a cannonball. And that person did all these turns and twists and spins. And that's only a 3 out of 10. I thought that was really good. To the eye who looks at things at a different way, I feel like SGC is the judge that is more like the fan in the crowd who goes, nice dive. And PSA is the person with the clipboard who goes, nope, 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 nope. Yes, kind of. Is that possible? Does PSA need to just train us? And that's part of the thing. That's part of my thing. I know PSA is not watching my videos. And if they were watching them, they wouldn't be watching this far into it so far. But maybe PSA needs to pull back the curtain and give us a better idea, besides the little couple of sentences on the PSA website about what certain grades are, and show us, what does chipping look like and what kind of deduction does that result in? What does a couple of indentations on the surface look like? And what kind of deduction is it? Teach us how you're grading so that we're less upset when we don't get the grade that we think that it deserves. Or maybe we just got to deal with it and say, I'm going to go with the company that I like best. But I'm starting to think that maybe it's not that PSA is crazy. It's that now that there's another company who grades more on the overall look of the card versus the high definition technical issues on a card, that we don't understand why PSA isn't doing more of what SGC is doing, but it's just different. Maybe. I don't know. What do you guys think? Nonetheless, let's look at the next category of responses. And several people selected PSA. The first comment says, I am a PSA only person, mostly because I'm a little OCD and my collection and most of my card buying happens online, meaning the card being graded is as important insurance policy on high-end cards. After a while, I had mostly PSA slabs and some outliers, and it bugged me for them to not be uniform when looking through them, and for them to not all fit in the same box or binder. I want them all to present the same. I buy cards and other holders are raw, but then get sent to PSA eventually for this reason. This next comment says, Hey Greg, I'm PSA only mostly for presentation space reasons, and partly because it makes sense that PSA gives me the best options to find cards from all eras. My collection includes 1880s to today. Potentially greater resale value is in the back of my mind, but that's a far off factor, hopefully past my lifetime. I will buy SGC and Beckett holdered cards, but with an eye to either crack or cross them over in due time. Thanks for all the effort you put into the channel. This next comment says, on this week's question, I have only used and bought PSA. It was the market leader and I trusted its process. I have always used PSA for autographs that I did not get in person, such as Fan Ray, long ago New York Yankee players, and various Miami Hurricanes. It seems that the pandemic frenzy with monetizing cards displayed the company's limitations. Today, PSA gets some bad press on a variety of issues, and its grading is viewed as inconsistent at best. I still think PSA 10 rules the day. I don't love the look of SGC's label on the slab. Vintage and antique cards look nice with the black framing effect on the SGC slab. Some call it a tuxedo. Tag has an attractive slab, but have not tried grading there. Originally, it seemed interesting to get nice cards graded by PSA. I will probably do it again soon. I have some designated card candidates, but I consider doing it with some trepidation. The hobby's dark corner challenges us to maintain our youthful enthusiasm. Heather from the Sunshine State. Oh, yeah. I mean, PSA was the industry standard, and they were the leader of the pack, and they still are. I mean, let's face it. When you just look at the number of submissions and grades that happen in a month, PSA is number one, has always been number one. Well, hasn't always been number one, but has been number one. They were a long time ago, and they are now. There have been stretches in the middle where they were certainly being challenged. Now, I'm going to say something here that I think some people might be offended by, but it's not intended to be offensive. So, a lot of the collectors that are PSA through and through people, PSA through and through collectors, if I go down the line, and even on YouTube channels, you can go, well, who are the hard, fast, furious, all-in PSAs, their company people? And not that they won't buy an SGC card, but when you think of who are the standbys for PSA support, I think of Mike Moynihan, right? Baseball collector. I think of Dylan, Double D. He clearly prefers PSA. I think of Adam, Splendid Sports. Now, that is not to say that they don't own any SGC or other labels. And that's not to say that they won't buy those. But at least from my viewing of their channels, they tend to, when they submit, if they submit, they tend to submit the overwhelming majority of the time to PSA. Now, what do all of them have in common? Now, I'll look at the opposite, true. Who are some people that are SGC people? strong SGC, like to the point where if they get a card in PSA, they'll cross it over. Now, the ones that jump out, and I know I'm missing people. I get it. But the ones that jump out to me are like my buddy Theo, Clemente collector. Sammy Thunder is a lot of SGC. I know he has some PSA stuff, but and Theo does too. But generally speaking, they want SGC, and they have crossed things over to SGC from PSA. John 3D 80s Kid, he's an SGC guy. So what do those guys have in common? So when you compare them, you go, I've got this group, which is mostly PSA preference, and then this group, which is mostly SGC preference. Now, I'm making a generalization here, and it's not to say that anybody's right or wrong. I mean, my dad, okay, I'll use my dad. My dad was SGC only from the late 90s until like 2003. Now he is not exclusive to SGC, but definitely prefers SGC. So he would be a counter to what I'm saying right now. But the people that have been collecting all the way through, like Dylan, Adam, Mike, Moynihan, those guys tend to lean toward PSA. And part of the reason I think that they tend to lean toward PSA is because PSA was pretty much respected the whole time through. And there were times along the line where SGC was kind of looked down upon by a lot in the community. Now that's, again, I'm making generalizations. This is not always the case. The people who came back into the hobby more recently and weren't collecting for the last 10, 15 years, those people tend to go, why would anybody be with PSA? SGC's better. And so they're heavy in SGC. Now, if anybody I'm making a generalization about, I just named 6 channels, 3 on each side. If I'm making an incorrect statement, please correct me, because I'm not trying to do that. That's just by watching what you collect. That's tend to what I have observed. And so I think that some of the people who are steadfast for PSA are the people who have been in consistently for a long period of time and remember some of that negativity that people had with SGC. And so the people who have gotten back in and are really heavy in SGC, I think they didn't experience a lot of that negative thought about SGC that SGC used to have that I don't see SGC having now. But there was a period of time where SGC was the stepchild. It was the stepchild. It was looked down upon. That's just the way that it was. Now, don't be mad at me if you don't agree with me, but a lot of people felt for a long time that SGC was a far inferior option. And people will come back at me and they'll say, you don't know what you're talking about. SGC's been a leader in pre-war for a long, long time. I absolutely agree, and I absolutely know, and I absolutely remember, and I absolutely experienced the SGC pre-war thing. The cards from the 10s and the 20s and the 30s have a long history of PSA because the duller colors, the black and the whites, popped better with that black tuxedo look that frames the cards in SGC. But as soon as you started getting into the more colorful cards in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it was like PSA was just dominant. So part of the issue that SGC has versus PSA is for a long, long time, people were not submitting many SGC cards from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So a lot of these longtime collectors, they kind of had this thing of, that's not the best option. PSA is the best option. And at the time, the price difference of submission was very similar, and the turnaround time was much more similar. And a lot of that has changed. So does that mean that the people who are PSA people are wrong? No, but I also understand why they want their collection to match with what the rest of their collection looked like, because for a long, long time it was like PSA. And now all of a sudden you have this mix. So where am I at now, honestly? Well, I just told you I just did a submission to PSA recently. I will tell you this, those were all modern cards. I have done recent SGC submissions. I did an SGC submission a couple months ago. Those were vintage cards. So for me, part of it depends on what am I submitting. I absolutely think SGC looks the best in vintage. And I absolutely think PSA looks the best for modern. That's just my opinion. Again, not the right answer, not the right opinion, just my opinion. So I think part of the divide is SGC caught up. SGC is legitimate. And it wasn't that long ago that they were not looked at the same level as a PSA by the majority of the collecting community. So if you're all about PSA, one of my questions is, are you somebody who came back into the hobby recently and you're all about PSA? And if you're all about SGC and you just came back into the community, are you all about SGC recently? I think some of the divide could be from the experience of the past. I remember my grandpa, my granddad, my dad's dad. He would always say, I only buy American cars. He would buy Fords. And I'm like, but granddad, like the Japanese cars, the Hondas and the Toyotas, those are really nice cars. But he lived through the experience of when they weren't. He lived through the experience of there was a time where the Japanese cars that were going around the United States and the Japanese products were not that nice. But things changed. So was he wrong for wanting to stay with the Ford American made when the Japanese cars were also very good cars? No, he wasn't wrong, but his past experience is a lot of what led to his belief of the current situation, even if things have changed. And I think while SGC used to be looked down upon a little bit, at least by a lot of the community, not everybody, of course, but now that SGC is legit, I mean, they are legit in my eyes, a lot of the PSA collectors still kind of thumb their nose at them. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but they experienced a time when that was maybe a fair feeling to have. And it might be why they're still all PSA. Let's look at some more comments on other opinions. Some people said, doesn't matter the slab, just any slab. The first one says, slab agnostic here, but I definitely want my collection graded. I know a lot of people don't trust grading companies, but I trust them more than Joe Schmo selling raw vintage on eBay. As a lone wolf type of collector, like you described Junk Wax Hero, most of my purchases are online, as I'm far from any sort of card shop. With how risky raw cards can be, especially with iconic cards, I'm not putting my trust in someone that I do not personally know. As for the grading companies, I just want a card that looks great, is well-centered, and most importantly, is something that I would be proud to display. So I don't necessarily care if it's a PSA 7 or an SGC 5 or a BVG 4. If it looks sharp and is something I would be proud to display, I'm happy with it. This next one says, for next week's question, I mostly collect slabbed cards of SGC, PSA, and BVG BGS, although I do have a few slab cards from different companies. I try to focus on the big three grading companies and look for the best looking card in one of those slabs for the most affordable price. I sometimes can get a better looking card in a Beckett or SGC holder than a PSA holder in the same grade, even though they are priced less than a PSA card. I find all three companies do a pretty good job of grading, but eye appeal, centering, and value are the most important things to me. This next one says, I'm completely slab-gnostic. I have more PSA cards only because they're more available. However, I will buy nice cards in any slab. At the National, my cards were 50% PSA and 50% SGC. I had not purchased 50-50 in years. It seems to this collector that SGC has gained market share in vintage and was much more available this year. I remember a National where SGC was hardly available for 50s and 60s cards right before the pandemic. I believe I only bought one SGC card that year. I am so jealous of this group of people who said they could care less what the slab is. I am so jealous of that, genuinely. For years and years and years, I was PSA only. And then the more I looked at SGC stuff, I said, man, I am limiting myself. I have to be buying some of these cards because the cards are so nice and they look so good and the grading is legit and it's a legit company. And if I submit cards, I don't want to wait for 3 months from PSA. SGC will have it back in 2 or 3 weeks. I'm jealous of people who are able to look past the slab. But I'm a lunatic, okay? I am a lunatic who has major issues with uniformity. I eventually said, okay, I'm going to do some PSA. I'm going to do some SGC because SGC is good. And I want to have some of these cards. But it still drives me crazy that my collection doesn't match. So what do? I have rows of just SGC cards and then rows of PSA cards. In some of my, frames on the walls of cards, I'll have this is all SGC and then the next one is all PSA. I have to group them together because I'm a lunatic and the lack of matching drives me crazy. But Greg, you always say buy the card, not the grade. Buy the card, not the holder. I completely agree I do believe that. And I feel like I've tried to do that. And I feel like I've proven that to you. I mean, just looking at the National, I bought 2 really big cards. I bought my Ernie Banks rookie, and that was a PSA holder. And then I bought my Walter Johnson T206. That was an SGC holder. I'm not limiting myself to one anymore. But it does kind of drive me crazy. I do want to buy the card, not the holder. But I also want the holders to match. I know they have, and I've looked into doing this too. So slab mags, I know they're expensive. I know, why would you get those? I know. But I looked into slab mags and I was like, can't the slab mags fit to be uniform? But they don't. So the slab mag is bigger for the SGC than the PSA. But what if they had done it where the PSA slab, the PSA slab mag and the SGC slab mag were the same size, even though the slabs inside of them are a different size? They could have just had built in the frame a little thicker or something so that when they're all in my container, they're uniform. Again, this is an illness. I get it. I'm jealous of you guys. I'm jealous of you guys who can not be bothered by a lack of uniformity because I'm bothered by it. but I do want to buy the card, not the grade. Now, there were some responses that didn't fit into one of these categories. Let's take a look at some of those. Now, there were some other comments as well that didn't really fit a category, so I wanted to share some of those as well. I buy many different company slabs. PSA offers the best resale value, but I like the looks of the SGC Tux better. It makes the artwork of the card pop more, and that's what it should be all about anyway. Beckett is nice if you can get extra information on subgrades. Tag would provide you with even more information, and they are interesting slabs too. SGC has the easiest to work with because of the quick turnaround times, and they don't hold your cards hostage if they determine they are worth more because of the grade they receive. So for my PC cards, I would be happier with SGC. For resale, PSA may be the smarter option. Keep up the great work. Another comment says, answer to this week's question, I don't care about the slab at all, and I am fine with raw cards. My only objection is to find the best example of the card for the price. Sometimes it turns out to be the slab card, but often it's raw. If the card resides in one of those hideous PSA slabs with a crumpled baggie, uncentered and or positioned diagonally, I will always break it out. The only caveat, I do steer clear of the lesser known, less established TBGs, as to me this only increases the odds that the card inside is altered or trimmed and could not pass legitimate authentication. This next comment says, buy what you like. It's your collection. For next week's question, I buy the card, not the slab. I have a Frankenstein collection because some of the cards I collect are rarer, and I have to buy them in the slab they're in, or raw sometimes. Some cards are too costly to be reslabbed, especially with PSA. Another one says, I'll collect any slab but prefer raw. If the slab is from some obscure grading company, then I tend to shy away. If I'm buying over the internet for a more expensive card, then I want it graded. This next comment says, most of my collection is ungraded, but I have bought some graded cards in recent years. I have no preference regarding which company's slab the card is in, although the SGC Tuxedos looks great. I have cards in PSA, SGC, Beckett, and a few others I can't think of at the moment. The bulk of my collection was purchased prior to 2000, and prior to grading being a thing. A large portion is from opening packs and trading with friends. I prefer ungraded and still buy a lot of ungraded, although I am not opposed to buying graded if the deal is right. And finally, the last comment says, I'm influenced when I buy PSA slabs. I think they look ugly. My favorite slab is the CGC slab, but if I think I may sell the card at some point, I usually get the PSA. Okay, more great comments. That last comment really cracked me up. It says, I hate PSA slabs. They're hideous. But if I think I'm going to resell the card, I buy PSA slabs. I mean, hey, there's not a right way to do this. There's not a wrong way to do this. There's just different ways to do this. And your way, if it works for you, is good. Don't let somebody else tell you you have to be all PSA. You have to be all SGC. You have to be mixed. If you're not mixed, you're crazy. Listen, this is our hobby that we are enjoying. And you have to enjoy it in the way that you enjoy it the most. So that is, at the end of the day, the thing that you've got to remember the most. Make sure that you are enjoying the hobby and whatever that happens to look like for you. So that brings us to this coming week's question. So let's go ahead and take a look at that here. More and more collectors seem to be collecting vintage cards from lesser known manufacturers. What's your favorite release from the 1940s to the 1960s that wasn't produced by Topps, Bowman, play ball, or leaf, and why? So I think that one of the things that a lot of us enjoy about cards is the hunt. It's finding cards that aren't as easy to find as others. And that eBay searching and that card value box searching and the searching at shows is a lot of fun. And as a result, I think a lot of us like collecting baseball cards. We like collecting baseball cards from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But some of those cards, like the Topps sets and like the Bowman sets, are fairly easy to come by. I mean, you could, type in 1955 Bowman right now into eBay, and there would be a lot of results. But there may not be of some of the other sets. Now, I've asked some questions kind of like this before, but I do think that there is a growing interest in people getting into some of these other releases that are not the wider releases. And I think there are a lot of people who would be open to some of these sets and some of these different, variations and varieties of cards if they knew they existed, but they may not be as familiar with them. So I'm asking you to share what is a set or couple of sets from this golden age, golden era of baseball cards and baseball to share with us, and why is it a set that you like? Why do you like it? Because if others see it and others like it, maybe they'll start collecting it too, and you could have more people to share the joy of that set with and collect with moving forward.